Hello, beautiful alchemist. Welcome to Reiki Radio. I am your host, Yolanda, and today we have a very interesting conversation with one of my favorite guests. Her name is Danielle Dulsky, and you will remember Danielle from previous interviews. She is an author. She is a word witch. She is the author of this new book called The Night House and numerous other titles, which we have had conversations with her about here on Reiki Radio, including The Holy Wild Grimoire, Bones and Honey, which we discussed last time, and The Woman Most Wild. So she is a heathen visionary, a painter, a poet, a storyteller, and a word witch. She teaches internationally and has facilitated circles, embodiment trainings, communal spell work, and seasonal rituals since 2007. She is the founder of the Hag School and believes in the emerging power of wild collectives and sudden circles of curious dreamers, cunning witches, and rebellious artists in healing our ailing world. So, we have a conversation today again about the Night House, but I have to tell you a few things about this book before we dive into it. One, Danielle has a beautiful, I want to say, relationship with not just story, but she also speaks a lot to the magic and the wisdom embedded within fairy tales. And this book in particular, The Night House, I never know what to expect when I read the books of the authors who come to share with us here on Reiki Radio. But this book really gives you a way of considering fairy tales, not just for their wisdom and the magic that is embedded within, but how these stories are mirrors and reflections of your own lives and your own shadows, and how you can use the wisdom from these stories to extract out more of your own story, or learning to work with these mysteries and teachings that are within. So, if you're like me, you're probably like, how on earth? The magic and the wisdom, the what in the fairy tales. I really was curious about this, but she does a great job of not just sharing certain stories with us, but this book is very interactive in that she also provides ways of working with story. Again, how we can use these beautiful stories as reflection and mirrors, and how we can do even some externalized things that help us to come into connection with the magic within these words. You will learn a lot about fairy tales, including the origin, what their intentions were. Danielle also has an upcoming writing intensive called The Book of the Wild Daughters. So if you want to learn more about that and her work, be sure to visit her website, danielledulsky.com. The link is down in the show description. If you want to follow her on Instagram, her Instagram is at wolfwomanwitch. I will put the link for that in the show description as well. So that's all I'm going to tell you for now. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. I would love to hear from you when it's over. So be sure to reach out to me and Danielle, and I will see you on the other side. Okay, beautiful alchemist, we have a treat today because we have the beautiful Danielle Dulsky back with us again. Thank you so much for joining me today, my love.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. So excited.
Yeah, me too. Well, this is the thing. Every time I've had an opportunity to have a conversation with you, it's always been around one of your books. And so it's always on the heels of me reading just like the juiciness of your words and how you write. And if anyone has listened to the other interviews, you'll notice that's what I always say. Her writing is so beautiful. Like it's haunting and beautiful at the same time. It'll mess your head up. It's so good.
Thank you.
So
Best
you're,
compliment ever.
yeah, it's the truth. And you're back again with this book, but and we're going to get into the Night House. But before we talk about it, I just want to say how interesting it is that it's an interactive book. And
Yeah.
you give these prompts and these invitations for us to also write and tell our own fairy tale of sorts. But before we get into it, I wanted to know about this. So, for everyone listening, this book, in a way, is about fairy tales, but so much bigger than that. How did you even come across this knowing that fairy tales are embedded with these sacred wisdoms? Is that something that's commonly known?
I think it is something that's commonly known to an extent because the hallmark of a fairy tale and what would distinguish a fairy tale from another type of folk tale is that there is the element of magic in it. So, that part is well known and studied in all of the scholarly academic places. But then the question is, and do you take that magic seriously?
Yes, yes, yes.
So most of the witches or the spiritual practitioners will at least consider that, okay, so maybe this spell that's in this old story would actually work. And so I think that most people might stop at the point where they're like, okay, there's the element of magic, there's the element of wonder inside this story, but my invitation is to take it a step further and like not only acknowledge that it's there, but try it on
Yes.
and see if it works, just like you would with a spell in a spell book.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, um, fairy tales always have to have something in them that like defies the rational, that makes you consider the impossible. And a good story is kind of a container where when you're existing in that space between the once upon a time and the ever after, no matter who you are, well, maybe there's some exceptions, but no matter who you are, if you're like really understanding the story, you're considering that the impossible is true within the confines of that story. But then, can you then take that outside after the ever after has come? Can you then carry that into your life and consider that it's still true, that the
Yeah.
impossible could still actually be real and influence your life in these different ways? So, yeah. So I was like, okay, let's take this weird thing and make it even weirder.
Yeah. I mean, it was so interesting because yes, I think that's the part that struck me about this book and even your introduction and how you really explain a lot of this to us. You know, we've all, I think most of us, I would say, have been exposed to fairy tales, since a young age. And it just stops there. And it's not something that most of us aren't looking at it as it's serious in any kind of way. But after reading this book and really flashing back to all kinds of stories and fairy tales specifically, seeing these themes that occur again and again and these archetypes that occur again and again, I was like, oh, wow. Because, as a child, so much of that just goes over your head. And I don't have
Right.
children, so as an adult, I'm not reading them to children. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So could you
Hmm.
talk a little bit about how there was a time where the fairy tales weren't necessarily for children?
Yeah, I mean, there's a school of thought that fairy tales were never intended for children, and that the prevalence and the fact that they have continued. So, if it's a collected fairy tale, it was orally transmitted over centuries, if not millennia. We don't even really know where those stories came from, the ones that were orally transmitted. Even the literary fairy tales that were written and we know who the author is, those tend to still contain elements from these orally transmitted stories. And so the fact that they have survived for so long
Yeah.
and really do have these, yes, sometimes there's gnarly bits and death in them. Sometimes there's whole death rituals and ceremonies in them. And the fact that they not only exist now, but that they existed when they existed, and
Right.
they weren't hunted, they weren't burned at the stake, because they were just children's stories. So I'm approaching it like there wasn't one person who decided, let's frame fairy tales as children's stories so that they can survive being hunted. But I'm thinking there was kind of a hidden intelligence afoot in these old stories. And, as an energy practitioner, like the medicine's always going to go where it needs to go. And so if the stories were the medicine, they had a way of just going where they needed to go. They were transmitted primarily by women also, even though they were collected primarily by men, like the Brothers Grimm. Still, they were transmitted primarily by women. And so that was another way they were taken less seriously. And not just any women, but primarily the low class women,
Yes.
the weaver women, the women that didn't have a lot of money. And so even though these stories have like the kings and the queens in them, it was never about kings and queens. It was
Yes.
always about like really subverting the system and sometimes even taking the whole system down.
Yes.
And so, you can think about like our foremothers really tucked some, not just magic inside these stories, but sometimes there's like strategy
Yeah.
in these stories. And they were dismissed as these, just these benign children's stories given the name fairy tale. So that's relatively recent, but we hear fairy and we think that it's this kind of sweet creature that's going to grant our wishes or whatever. But even that in the Irish tradition, fairies are the trickster. So they might grant you wishes. They also might kill you and eat you or like
Right.
hide you underground. So the stories themselves are these trickster characters. And I just love that about them. Like, it's similar to there were whole, recipes for that upheld reproductive rights that were tucked inside folk songs. And I was like, oh, it's just a song, but no, it's
Yeah.
this whole recipe for what you might do, right? When you don't have anywhere else to go. So, yeah. So I love that about these stories. They're really like how to subvert the system.
Well, it's
And
interesting now that you say there's a couple of them. I think, well, Little Red Riding Hood, which is referenced in the book, but the repetition of even certain words, like when you think of it in terms of there may be, this magic embedded or a ritual or spell embedded in these stories. And that part is standing out right now, that how much there's a repetition throughout the story of certain words, certain phrases, and what that may be pointing to. So
yeah.
I wanted to ask you though, since you bring up the how old all of this really is, are there any stories that you can point to a very specific time frame and see what was going on in that region at the time in comparison to what the story may have been revealing?
With literary fairy tales, yes, because we know when they were written
Yeah.
and who the author was. So there's this great book called Women Writing Wonder, and most of it is about women in the French court. So uniquely, these were higher class women, but still they were trying to take the whole system down.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, they were in it. They were like in the king's castle writing these stories, which is just so cool. So there are some instances where you can do that. For the most part, though, the orally transmitted stories, there's a Jungian idea that maybe they originated in someone's dream.
Mm,
And, like back in, I don't know, whatever, 900 or so AD, somebody had this dream and we didn't have TV. And so they were like, you're not going to believe this dream that I had. And they recounted their dream just like we would now to
right.
our weird friend that will tolerate us telling them what our dream is. And then it became kind of whispered down the lane. And then it turned into this story over that does contain, since you were mentioning the words, those old charms that are in the stories, even though they may have been translated from a different language, still, like, think of the accumulated wisdom over so many centuries with people telling the story that contains that same charm or
Yes.
that witch's spell, like those exact same words. I just think that is so cool. So yeah, for the most part, the idea is, the stories kind of were grassroots stories. They came from the bottom. And so we don't really know what was going on at the time because it was the miller or the farmer or the weaver woman or the midwife who's telling these stories. And they weren't the ones who were writing the history books.
Right.
So it is difficult to figure out, exactly what was going on with some of these stories because we don't really know where they were seeded. And so I just love that idea that like somebody had a weird dream and
Yeah.
and that lit the fire and then it continued.
But even this book, though, so that's what I thought when reading it. I thought, how interesting the way that you, again, made it an interactive book. So, for everyone listening, there are stories and fairy tales within the book, but there's this invitation to, like, what if you were the one that was telling a story? And then there are these ideas and these prompts of how to embed in your own, like little hidden wisdom, and even creating altars that are symbolic of these stories. And I thought, how brilliant is that as another way of keeping these stories going, creating this line of connection and personalization in these times where we're so distracted. I think a lot of things that were passed down could easily get lost now in these modern
Right.
times. But the
Hmm.
way that you put this together is an interesting way of almost reviving it and presenting it in another way. So, what made you even
Yeah.
want to do that? Is that how you just work with story?
Yeah, I've been into this idea of personal myth work, which I think was introduced to me by the work of Bill Plotkin, like, I don't know, 15 years ago when I started reading his books. He's an eco psychologist, so he doesn't do a lot with story, at least not that I have read in any of his books, but he does talk about like this kind of ecological map of the psyche. And so there is this kind of magical way that he looks at the not just the world but the human mind specifically, and he alludes at a few different points in his books to personal myth work, and I was like, oh, I really want to know more about what this is. And then was deep diving into Dr. Estes and Joseph Campbell and really trying to figure out, okay, what is personal myth work and how do I do it? And there's one line in one of Joseph Campbell's books, which I think is Pathways to Bliss, and he says like, you're never going to feel like you get it. Like you always feel like you're dancing around it when you're working with personal myth work, which is essentially being able to see your story, your personal story that you are living inside of another story, or being able to have this kind of narrative intelligence and see the arc of your life. So of course you're always going to feel like you're dancing around it, because if you knew the end of the story, then you'd be dead.
Right, right, right.
So, and we don't want that. So I do love that idea of like being able to see your story inside another story. And then as far as what the draw for me was to write this book, it was seeing, not only for me but with people that I would sit in circle with, just the kind of shock over how these stories can really be like oracles.
Mm.
Like when you get a reading from a psychic and they just tell you your entire life and you're in that kind of stunned place, a good story can do that same thing for
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
And so having these moments where we were gathering what I call our witches proof that these stories are incredibly magical, and being like, I just have to, how can I translate this to a book? So yeah, so that was sort of the draw for me, is to try to figure out how to give that experience of the beauty of personal myth work inside my own weird way of organizing a nonfiction book.
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's thought provoking. And that was a thing
Yeah.
because even reading it, even though I didn't do all the exercises real time, I was like, wow, this is really, really thought provoking. But it also, I think, is a beautiful way of helping us to see all forms of story differently, because I think we can take it for granted sometimes. And maybe, like, yes, there may be a character that we relate to, or sometimes there's just a really good story and you tell someone about it, but I don't know. It's almost like we don't hold on to it maybe in the ways that they used to. Whereas
Yeah.
something about the way this book is constructed, I think it does. It's more of a like, hey, look at why we are in relationship to story and how we
Right.
can be in bed with story and what does it do, and will you pass these stories on, but with a different kind of like awareness and intention even.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Like, I think it's the handless maiden that Dr. Esty says should take 7 years to tell, and it's
Ah,
like, who's going to listen to a story for 7 years
right, right.
about? But something like to give. anybody just like a little bit of proof that it works is to just do this one thing. You don't have to do like all of the rites and the rituals that are in the book, because I didn't intend it to necessarily be, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some people that do every single ritual that's in the book, but really it was like figure out one of them at least
Yeah.
for each story so that you can at least get a little bit of proof that the story has that element of wonder in it. But it works not only with fairy tales, it works with dreams, it works with the Netflix series that you're watching. It doesn't have
Yeah.
to, it can be any story, like you just said, any story. And after you meet that story for the first time, you name what question remains after the story's over. So, you know, we know that feeling when we've been swimming in this series that we're binging for a week and then it's over. And there's
Yes.
that a little bit of a sense of loss or something if it was good. And you have these like remaining questions, and they might feel like plot holes. They might feel like something a character did that's frustrating. But if you name that question about the story or the series or whatever, and then you're like, how is that the very question of my life right now? That
Yes.
works every time.
Yeah.
Like if I'm in an open circle with people and I don't know who's there, like I just did a book event where it was, I had no idea who these people were, the sea of strangers. And I just can trust that that thing is going to give everybody this sense of like, oh shit.
Right. 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 Well, that was
And
like the big kicker too, reading that just so people know you have this exactly what you're sharing in the book
yeah,
to do this.
yeah. They do nothing else. They don't have to build the altars. They don't have to go for the wild walks or do anything else that's in there. Just do that one thing, even if for only one story. And it just gives you this proof that there is obviously this hidden energetic current in these stories that's going to go exactly where it needs to go. And, you know, they're reading the book solitarily, I'm assuming, unless there's a book club or something. But if you're in a circle of people in real life and everybody's sharing their individual questions that they have
Yeah.
about the story, everybody's are different always. Everybody has
Yes.
different questions. And so that's when you get this proof like, oh, that really was just my question. Nobody else is wondering why
Right.
Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother let her get eaten. Nobody else cares about that. That's just my question. So yeah, so that I think that that's a good way to begin personal myth work, is just to gather this proof that these stories do have like these really unique wisdoms that are just meant for you
Yeah.
individually, and then you can go from there if you want. But yeah, that's a good like kind of seed for beginning to work with story.
Yeah. And I wanted to say it too. I'm glad you brought up Little Red Riding Hood because in the book, and I would say with the last book too, I can't remember the name at the moment. It was your book, the last one.
uh,
There were
Bones and
certain,
Honey.
yes, yes, yes. Oh, it was so good. But there are
Thank you.
certain stories in there that I never heard before. And again, gives you a whole different way of looking at, these beautiful stories. And when I read about the Red Hood, one of the things that stood out to me was thinking about the symbolism of the Red Hood.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the story is named after it, essentially.
Yeah.
And I was like, God, never even thought about that. Like the symbolism behind this and how you even weave in like the thoughts of this ancestral
Right.
thing that we can have and what it can mean or how it could be protection, whatever it is. Could you talk a little bit about that just because most people are familiar with
With Little Red
that
Riding Hood.
story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she was carrying the medicine to her grandmother's house. I mean, the whole thing, I think, is a metaphor for ancestral healing.
Yeah.
And yeah, the red hood. So in the old stories, red tends to be the color of magic. I don't know if that's primarily true in Northern European stories and Celtic stories, but for sure in the Celtic stories, red would be the color of magic. So like, you know, the leprechaun is going to have a red hat on
Mm.
inevitably. And so there's that, but also red's the color of blood, red's the color of sacrifice. Little Red Hood, even though it is so weird that that's like the story most people might be familiar with, it has a slew of really gnarly endings. I mean,
Yes.
not that I chose on purpose not to include a lot of those in the book, but it's very Googleable, like the different endings. There's like this so in the traditional story, you know, she's tasked with carrying this basket of wine and bread to her grandmother's house, and the Red Hood is meant to protect her, to keep her from being shot by the hunters, presumably, and yet that's what gets her seen by the
Yes.
wolf on the road. And then she, you know, in her innocence, gives away the exact location of her grandmother's house to the wolf. So the wolf runs off to go eat the grandmother. So by the time little Red Hood arrives at the grandmother's house with the medicine, the grandmother's in the belly of the wolf. The wolf is dressed like the grandmother. And then we all know that scene where she's like, "Why, grandmother, what big ears you have, what big eyes you have," right? and then and then the wolf also devours little Red Hood. And then there's this series of endings. So the one that I chose to go with was, there's a huntsman who's walking by who hears the screams. He comes in, and then he's the one who liberates little Red Hood, and then little Red Hood is the one who pulls the grandmother out alive. There's different versions where like either everybody's dead or nobody gets eaten. The gnarliest version of the story is really the wolf is kind of torturing little Red Riding Hood for like hours, and
Wow.
this whole thing. Yeah. Um, you know, if we're looking at the warrior archetype in the form of the huntsman, your inner warrior is the part of you that is always preparing for the spiritual battle. So you can kind of track and define your personal inner warrior by looking at what are the certificates that you collect, the trainings that you do, the books that you read, the experiences. If you kind of like really make a list, like a kind of witch detective, and then you look at the patterns in those things, it is obvious that you're preparing for something. So then
Right.
it's like, well, what is that battle? So the warrior doesn't find meaning in the war. The warrior finds meaning in the preparation for whatever that generative conflict's going to be. So we can think about the end of that story as being, you know, it's the inner warrior who liberated innocence and the elder from the belly of the beast. And so, you know, there's this task that your inner warrior is meant to perform. And if it is ancestral healing, which I think for all of us, at least in part, it is,
Right.
then your inner warrior is preparing to do that. So, you know, in some way, whatever your sacred work is in the world, it's about healing the wounds of your grandmothers. Um, you know, so that they don't get passed on and
Right.
continue through the lineage. So yeah, I think that that whole story, and like the fact that a lot of us heard it as children, is just so incredible, that like we were given this whole recipe for
Right.
ancestral healing when we were like 5 years old.
Listen, Danielle, no one's
Yeah.
going to look at that story the same now after hearing you say this. I really, truly, I love anything that makes me think about things in a way I never have before. And again, the way that you write is so beautiful. And even the invitations again and the rights and all these examples that you have of how we can interact with this and make it so personal. But one of the things you just said was about the different archetypes, like how we might be the warrior
Yeah.
in the story. And when I was reading that in the book and you talking about this, about the different archetypes and the potential of us being all of them,
Mhm.
just the same as, you know, Carl Jung would say, I guess, about our dreams,
Right.
it
Yeah.
made me think about tarot. And it
Hmm.
made me think about how a lot of times in cards, that's how I look at them. Like if I was every character in this card, how is that
Yeah.
adding to the potential story or message here for me? But also the discomfort of claiming or owning that you could be also the big bad wolf, that
Yeah.
you could also be the character in the story, and what that erupts in us is
Yeah.
very interesting to have us look at us being
Right.
potentially everyone, not just the sweet one.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like a lot of the core complaints and the frustrating perceptions around fairy tales, or why people don't like them, you know, the kings and the queens, or why does there always have to be a wedding, and why is the knight or the king saving the princess?
Right.
And yeah, if you identify, so the first gate of meeting a story, you tend to identify with the most compelling character. So you're like, okay, I'm Little Red Riding Hood, or I'm the shape shifting seal woman. And then all of the other characters in the story are your people. So you're looking at the grandmother like your grandmother, you're looking at the wolf like your high school boyfriend or whatever. And and that's an important starting point. When you
Yeah.
get to the second gate, then they're all you. And so, that point of frustration that people have tends to go away when you're like, okay, but now you're the king. And like, okay, and now you're the knight on the
Yes.
on the horse, and so that idea that it's all about these kind of traditional gender roles and reaffirming them, it was never about that, because
Yeah.
really these stories were told and passed between women. And so it was never about like, be a good wife.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It was like, here's how to have a good life in this world that we live in. So I especially love the animal bride and animal bridegroom stories like Beauty and the Beast, because it's like, you're not just Belle, you're
Yep.
not
Yep.
just the beauty, you're also the beast. And so it's
Yes.
always about integrating that like creaturely, uncivilized self. Um, so yeah, so I think that that's so important, and that does tend to remedy the common hiccups that people have with fairy tales, is just get to this place where you can see all characters are you, and that tends to make a lot of those tensions ease at least a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like I mean, just from that lens of looking at it, there's a lot of healing potential in that. It also brings to mind the idea of how we harmonize or, you know, kind of reconcile the duality within ourselves. Like a lot of the
Right.
spiritual teachings point to, whether it's masculine and feminine, your light and your shadow, all of these different elements. It's just interesting to think of now, having like fairy tales on the shelf of, a recipe for the great work, so to speak, right? Like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, like it really literally comes in every form.
Yeah. Yeah, the stories are really an incredible container for duality, for the
Yeah.
light and the shadow. We know that we have the hero and the villain, but there's all of these other dualities that tend to be in these stories too. And like this, and then the story holds it all.
Yeah.
Is just, yeah, it's just really cool.
There was
Yeah.
something actually put I don't like putting things on the book, but I had to put a little note to talk to you. This struck me at the very beginning. Um, you say in the book, if we look, we see old stories or small books of magic. A fairy tale is a witch's grimoire disguised as a princess's dream. And I was like, ooh, whoa,
Yeah.
yes. And then a fate story where the beauty and the beast are one and the same. So funny that you
Yeah.
just mentioned that. Yeah, that really, really stood out to me again, because I think that's one of the hardest things in this kind of work, the realm of like people listening to the podcast. I always say, once you can get over the hump of just accepting that there are different facets of you and being okay
Yeah.
with that, like
Yeah.
that's the hard part. Once you can just say like, yeah, I am the beast. Like, yeah, I'm an asshole sometimes. You can like really own it and it's not a big deal. It's
Yeah.
incredible what starts to happen and what you realize. And again, I think that's what your book does. It's like, wow, like if we don't just automatically, you know, judge the characters in these stories that seem so mean and dark, because we always want to like cheer for, you know, not necessarily the underdog, but the one you feel compassionate for, the one
Yeah.
that seems helpless. But now that I'm saying it, it makes me think of just our lives in general. Like a lot of times we project so much, disdain on whoever we don't want to like or whoever it is without even
Yeah.
knowing what their story is or
Right.
what turned them into the monster, so to speak.
Yeah. Right. Right. What's the wolf story?
Right.
What's the wolf's grandmother doing?
Yes.
While he's off eating the other grandmother.
That's very
Yeah.
true. So I have to ask, because I can't even imagine how many fairy tales you have read over time. I think it's even mind blowing to know that there are that many of these stories. Because you just think the ones you grew up with, like that's it. But no, of course,
Yeah.
there's, you know, countless.
Yeah.
What tends to make you choose the ones that you choose? Like, for example, for this book, did you choose them because of the nature of the magic that you found within them? Was it the nature of the character? What draws you in?
Yeah, it's a good question because for me there's a difference between the stories that I'm trying to make sure that this is true before I say it, but I think it is. Like the stories that I am drawn toward, maybe not just drawn toward, but drawn toward, and like there's usually something weird about them. And then they kind of come back for me. So I'll dream about them, or I'll see them again, on the show that I'm watching, or scrolling on social media. I'll see something that reminds me of it. So they'll start to come back for me in some way, which is another idea of like, the medicine going where it needs to go. It just kind of won't leave me alone if
Yeah.
it's the right story. And sometimes there are those that I don't really feel called to share. I just feel like it's kind of mine, and it's not necessarily something that I need to feel that I'm in a position of, being able to teach it or whatever. And so there's that. And then the ones that I chose for this book and the ones that I tend to share with other people, they are the ones that come back for me, and they're the ones where I can see there's at least one kind of universal truth in them
Mhm.
that everybody will be able to understand and consider, even if they don't necessarily like believe it and think that it's the answer to all of the world's problems like I
Yeah.
might. Still, so there's some stories where I'm like, that's interesting and it keeps coming back for me, and I'm going to tend that story, but I think it's just mine. And then there's the ones that are all of that, and I can see some extra thing that I think would be medicinal for most people. So those are the ones that I chose for the book, but it was hard because I knew
Yeah.
that I needed only 13, and really there's 14 in the book because I tucked two inside one of the chapters. But it was hard to do that. I had this list of, I think, 30, and I was just kind of like trying to pare them down and pare them down until I got to the 13. But yeah, so like my process for what I call tail tending is, if a story's coming back for you, read it, like at least three different versions of it. They can be on somebody's blog somewhere. They don't have to be these academic, scholarly versions that you're finding. Read different versions of it so you can see the bones of the story and what feels like the common plot that exists no matter what, no matter who
Mm.
is telling it. And then maybe build a little house, like build a little altar. That takes a lot of the archetypal weight off of your shoulders. So I think that's more important with some stories more than others. If it's a really gnarly story and you're like dreaming about it, it keeps coming back for you, build it a house and be like, you live there. You
Yeah.
live on this table with these stones and this candle. You don't live inside my mind.
Yeah.
And then you try to speak that story out loud and let it be witnessed, if only by like your cat, your dog, your ghosts. And there's always something magical that happens when you do that. Like you speak something that you don't remember reading when you read the other versions of it. There's something that surprises you, there's something that you amplify, and then that for you is your teller's oracle. Like that
Mm.
thing that's weird in the actual speaking of that story, it can be a really incredible sign or omen or something. You don't realize it until you speak it out loud.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You just made me think of two. I want to share this about you. I don't know if we've ever talked about it in the previous interviews, but last year after reading Bones and Honey, thankfully you had an offering for a writing class. And at the time, I signed up for it because I have been saying for years, oh, I want to work on a book. I want to write a book. I want to write a book. And I also, though, like, at the time anyway, my schedule was so crazy that I don't know. So I thought, oh, if I take this class, it'll give me the structure. And it was so much more than I expected. I honestly thought it was just going to be this container that gave me a reason to stop and write. And then,
Yeah.
but the way, again, your way, the exercises, the thought-provoking questions. I mean, it wasn't just that. I mean, it really like say 1 week, you would give these questions, these ideas, these things to pull our own story out of us. And then I was like, I mean, I could sit with this for a month, Danielle. Like, what? But it was just so juicy. I mean, really, truly, like, even still, I'm like, I have to go back to that because of how
Yeah.
much you provided. So, in that, I wanted to ask you, not just as a writer, but as someone who seems to be very good at helping people to extract story and wisdom from their own experience, from their own feeling, all of this, just like you do in this book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your view of writing? Because it seems that you don't think it's just for like, oh, you want to be an author, that there's like this medicine in writing for us.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I could answer this in any number of ways. Let me think. So I every day. I think everybody has like a primary art. And if you go back to childhood and you look at the moments when you have felt like the most you could possibly be, these fleeting moments in time. So there'll be moments of like, say, watching the sunrise or like dancing with your friends, but then there'll be an obvious art pattern. And so there'll be, for some people it's cooking or it's gardening or it's painting or it's something else. But for me, if I go back through all my life chapters, I can clearly see that writing has been a consistent art really since I learned how to write. Like, I
Yes.
was like, this is obviously my thing. And I
Yeah.
would write like, adolescent erotica at my grandmother's house when I was like 11 and 12 years old. And I still have some of those stories. Like, it's obvious that it's been like my thing. So, for me, writing is my art, and so it's the way that I raise energy. And if I'm directing that toward a specific intention, like whether it's I want to change the world or it's just let me write this seductive story right now or revision this fairy tale or whatever it is, then that's the way that I'll do that. So writing is part of my art and my spiritual practice. I know that it can be oracular. So if I'm casting a spell, I tend to include what I call a write it real, where it's like a present tense description of my intention. And so
Mm.
what does it actually look and feel like when this moment comes to fruition that I think I want? And then writing can help me figure out, like, do I actually want it, or have I just been told that I should want this thing? And also, as I'm writing, I can get these weird otherworldly kind of voices that would come out in the writing that I do think is unique to certain writers, where you can get to that place of surrender and you're retracting your claws a little bit and you're not so much in control of every single word you're saying because there's something else that's coming through. So it can be a sort of psychic nod to the yet to come also as you're writing, if you can get into that kind of energetic state and allow that to happen. So there is, to answer your question, there's a difference between everything that I just named and then the way I write when I'm in a place of like structuring a book,
Right.
where I can invite some of that otherworldliness in, but then I'm doing this dance between, well, you might have heard me call it like the kind of spiral forward and spiral out kind of dance, where if I'm spiraling in, I'm just letting the words pour out of me, but then I have to step back and be like, okay, is anybody going to be able to understand what I just wrote? Where would this even go in the book if it does belong in the book? So there's more of that kind of back and forth dance between like my right and left brain if I'm writing a book. But that writing being oracular and part of my spiritual practice, that's always there, no matter what. And I think it's always been there. I
Yeah.
think, yeah. I don't know why, because I also have painting as one of my arts, and I could think about like, well, I must have painted when I was like a toddler, and writing is something that you learn how to do.
Right.
So I wonder about that sometimes, but yeah.
I think sometimes it finds you though too. Like when you said that, it's funny. One of my cousins, she bought me a Cabbage Patch Kid diary when I was like 7 or 8 years old,
Yay.
and it was actually a bribe. to like do something, like go with her somewhere because she was babysitting me and I had to, anyway, it was a bribe. But that Cabbage Patch diary, which I still have, since then, I always like I had a diary every year of my life after that. And then I would always use writing as a way of expression because I was also very introverted. So it was just,
Yeah.
and an only child. So it was like, it was my, I fell in love with writing. But it was that Cabbage
Yeah.
Patch diary that kind of initiated
Yeah.
that. And I don't know that I would have, I mean, maybe down the line it would have come through, but it was just such a random thing that led me to that.
Love that. I don't know if I had I had a Cabbage Patch doll. I don't know if I had a Cabbage Patch diary, but I remember like my diaries that had like the little locks on
Yes.
them,
Yeah.
and just like that being so cool. Like, oh, any I can put secrets in here, and
Yeah.
then I can hide the key, and like, the way I was raised was, pretty religious for the early part of my childhood anyway. And so like the fact that I could have secrets and
Yeah.
like nobody was going to come get me and I could word those secrets however I wanted inside this
Yeah.
little book. Yeah, yeah, what a cool thing.
So I have to ask you this though too, because even on your social media, when you post it, everything you write is poetic. I mean, I'm like, does she just think like this all day? Like I literally have read something and you put sometimes and I'm like, are her thoughts always like, and then, but talking to you now, just curious about with the way that you do work with words, whether through, the beautiful books that you write or the oracular part and how it ties into the other work that you do in the background or foreground of your life, I guess. Um, are you so intertwined with word that like, is it never not intentional for you? Like, do you ever just kind of like relax and all of a sudden words aren't as,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
sure.
but
Um,
do they tend to just be like this? It seems like you're spell casting all the time. And like while it's technically, yes, I guess we all are, even unconsciously, you seem very intentional in the way that you even, oh man, everyone go to her social media. You'll see what I mean.
I know what you mean. Because I think about this a lot because I work with a lot of people in terms of like magic and just a little bit like honing psychic skills and stuff. And so I know that everybody has like a dominant clair or like
Yeah.
their dominant psychic skill. And for me, and it seems most of the writers that I tend to work with, they're clairvoyant, and so they tend to see something
Yeah.
first and then they write about it. And I have a little bit of this odd synesthesia where sometimes I will see sound but rarely. But I have this thing back from childhood. This is giving away a big secret of mine because it is weird. It freaks people out sometimes. Where the way I learn certain words, I have it associated with a certain object. And so when I hear or say you're welcome, I will see a Reese's peanut butter cup. And I'm sure that that comes from my grandmother, who basically raised me, and she loved Reese's peanut butter cups. So I'm sure that it came from that. When I hear or say the word please, I have this specific like toy, this like plastic toy that pops up in my brain, and so I have these different images that are associated with words, and there's some sort of weird back and forth with me
Yeah.
where if I am met with an image, whether it's because I'm thinking about a fairy tale or something else, then I sort of automatically go into this state where I'm describing it.
Mm.
Like where I'm automatically trying to figure out what the words are in response to this image, whether it's something I'm seeing out in the world or it's something I'm imagining.
Yeah.
So there's writers that do that. They're sort of like they picture it and then they just kind of describe it, and I feel like that's me. And then there's other writers where the feeling is primary. They have to feel it first and then they might get the visual and then they can describe it. Or there's like a clairaudience thing going on where they actually hear the words
Yes.
first and then they are typing them out. So So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do have this weird compulsion to put to words bizarre things that I see.
Yes, yeah. No, no, that's incredible. I mean, it's really interesting. It's fine. I have to do that with people's names, otherwise, like, forget about it. But it's not,
Yeah.
some people do an association almost like rhyming it, but I have to visually create an image to remember your name. Because
Yeah.
honestly, I don't really, anyway, I won't say it. Well, I don't really care about names too much. I don't. And so I have to
Yeah.
consciously create something that gives it some
Yeah.
sort of interest to me. That's
There's
interesting
yeah,
though.
you have to read. It's called From Nowhere. It's by Eric Wargo. He's like a huge dream nerd. And so his big thing is dreams. But his book From Nowhere, which is his most recent, he talks about artists and writers and how we're basically all psychics. And so we're in communion with something that is greater than us. And so, there is some sort of information that wants to come through, and it'll come through no matter what. And so some people who have some writers or artists or even musicians that have that wound around, like, I want to put this out there, but I'm worried somebody's going to steal it, or something like that, that originality wound, that's really true, because
Yeah,
his idea is like, this thing wants to come down to earth and be made manifest. And so if you don't write that book that you're feeling called to write, somebody else is probably going to write that book.
right.
If you don't write that song, it's going to come through in another way. So I love that idea too. But yeah, you're in uh, this so what you just described about having to give a picture to the name, he talks about, when people used to memorize, going back to the oral tradition, if you think about, like, the Mahabharata, I think, is like 108,000 stanzas, and each stanza is like 108,000 lines or something like that, and it was transmitted orally. So, like, people had to memorize that
Right, right, right.
back in the day. And so how did they do it? Well, they did it in this way by giving this, like, kind of visual structure to it, like as if they were navigating this building or walking along this path or this temple, and every line was something that they were seeing. And
Yes.
so not everybody thinks that way, but if you do, you're supposed to be in this kind of top tier place
Oh,
as far as the psychics go.
good to know.
And that you would be more in his idea is like, you would be more in touch with the yet to come, and your future self, who he calls the long self, who would be speaking to you and trying to orient you, like, on the best path and keep you safe and all of those things. But yeah, I'm very into that idea.
Yeah, I think that's why I love, even to that point, like, you're writing so much because it brings so many visuals to mind. And when I
Mm-hmm.
think of it now that you say, if someone is speaking to me or I'm reading something and it doesn't really let me see it, I'm not
Yeah.
interested. I'm not,
Yeah.
I will totally check out. I'm like, I'm bored. I don't even care. I have
Yeah.
to, yeah, that's where I make the connection. So I'll definitely look at that. But I also wanted to ask you, because I know I just realized, oh my God, I only have like a couple minutes left with you. With the
Right.
Night House, one, curious about the name, but
Mhm.
also, because you do mention about how fairy tales, they do, there's a lot of shadow there, and they
Mhm.
can reveal a lot of shadow or the underbelly of things, or even within ourselves, mirror it back to us. And I can't think, I'm like, what is there a fairy tale that's light? Like, is there one that's like,
Probably not in its
yeah,
original version.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's,
Somebody yesterday was just saying, like, they keep thinking about Goldilocks and the Three Bears,
uh,
which is not one that I tend to think about, but I know it. And apparently, there's like a truck commercial where, like, the guy is looking for the perfect truck, and one's too small and one's too big.
oh,
So it's like made its way into
yes.
the pop culture or whatever. Um, and she was talking about the story and how, like, she read it and was like, I don't really understand the magic in this story. And
Yeah.
then we did like some digging.
Oh,
There's like some really, not necessarily as gnarly as Little Red Riding Hood, but there's like some darker themes in the original versions of the story, where I think, like, the girl gets eaten or something at the end. So um the idea is, like, if these stories were meant to be these healing tools for whoever was hearing them, then of course they would have like the wicked stepmother or the wicked stepsisters in them, because that was the part that was meant to be integrated.
Right.
And so I do think in every story that was orally transmitted, if you dig under it enough, there's probably gnarliness shadow there, because it was kind of the point, was to
Yeah.
be able to integrate that shadow in the way that you were meant to heal whatever those wounds were. So yeah, I don't know that there is like just like a purely sweet fluffy fairy tale.
Because then would it be considered something else, right? So it's like for
Yeah.
it to be considered a fairy tale, does it have to kind of fall into that, like I almost said Book of Shadows, but does it have to fall into that element of like there's some grit, there's something dark, there's some discomfort for it to even be considered? And then that's like a deceptive name when you think like a fairy tale. Like that sounds so nice. The
I know.
lies.
And yet that's part of why it could survive. So like going
Right.
back to like if there were any just purely sweet, pastoral stories like this, would they have survived as long?
Right.
Right? Like, because would they be as medicinal and need to move like the medicine needs to move? I don't know, because they wouldn't necessarily have a wound to go to.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, in the end, I'm not sure, but that's what I'm thinking right now.
That is so cool. They wouldn't have a wound to go to. I hope I
Yeah.
remember that. Well, that's one thing about you, Danielle. I mean, sitting and having conversation with you, and even through your work and even on your social media, truly, I'm not joking when I tell people go watch. Did you
Thank you.
post the book? And to that point, sign up for her newsletter too, because then you get the juiciness in your mailbox. But but really, I mean, you have a way with words. You really do. But you just have
Thank
an
you.
interesting way. I like the way that you see things. So it's interesting that you can see things the way that you do, deconstruct this all the way that you do, see the hidden magic the way that you do, and then after all of that, you put it into like this beautiful poetic, like, oh, and then like what? It's
Thank you.
incredible. Yeah. So I'm going to put the link, of course, for everyone down in the show description. The Night House is now available, but you also do have a writing intensive coming up. Could you tell us a little bit about that and where we can go to register?
Yes. So my only writing intensive that I'm doing this year is called the Book of the Wild Daughters, and it's essentially everything that we just talked about. So it's like looking at your life story and whether you would plan to write a memoir or a grimoire or some other more prescriptive nonfiction book that would have these kind of personal stories and memoir bits in it. You would be able to apply the program to that. But each week we're going to work with a different fairy tale, and it's being able to see your story through the lens of that particular story. If only sometimes you just need like a single image, right? Like
Yeah.
and that's something else that I try to emphasize in the book and to people, is like you don't have to resonate with the whole plot. And in fact, I think we're maybe not meant to for most of these stories. Like if you're just drawn to this image of a little girl wearing a red hood standing on a road and here's a wolf that she's talking to, like sometimes it's just that kind of snapshot
Yeah.
that can give you the muse that you need to be able to see your story through the lens of that particular tableau. So yeah, so we're going to be spending like all of autumn doing that.
Oh, very cool.
And they can register on my website. So danielledulsky.com is where all the things are.
So we'll put that in the show description, of course, danielledulsky.com. Could you please tell your Instagram? Because I always mix up between wolf and woman.
Yeah, wolf woman witch.
Wolf,
at,
woman,
at wolf
witch.
woman witch. Yes, three W's.
Yes. At Wolf Woman Witch on Instagram. Also, she has a Facebook. So, all of that, I'll put all of it down in the show description. But I have to thank you so much again. One, for your work. I love artists in any form. I'm always in awe and think what a gift that we get exposed to the beautiful works of other humans. So, truly, thank you for
Yeah,
being thought provoking and poetic and all the things that I love. But
yeah.
everyone, really read this book. You will be surprised. at the way that Danielle gets you to see and think about things. And if you want to join the intensive, the Book of the Wild Daughters, go to danielledulsky.com. Thank you so much for taking time again today, my love.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, anytime, and we will see you all soon. All right, beautiful alchemist. First of all, we have to thank Danielle Dulsky for coming to have this beautiful conversation with us today. As you all know, I love anyone's story and the work that they do that can inspire us in our own paths and the work that we may do. So be sure to check out her new book, The Night House. The subtitle is Folklore, Fairy Tales, Rites and Magic for the Wise and Wild. Again, her name is Danielle Dulsky, and the link for the book is down in the show description. If you want to join Danielle for her writing intensive called The Book of the Wild Daughters, be sure to visit her website, danielledulsky.com. And as I mentioned in the conversation, even her social media is very poetic and beautiful with what she shares. So be sure to follow her over on Instagram at Wolf Woman Witch. So that is it for today, my loves. I thank you so much for being here on Reiki Radio. Be sure to share these episodes if you enjoy them. I really appreciate you being a part of the community. And thank you again to Danielle for sharing with us. I will see you very soon. Remember to always journey in love.